Hello! Today I'm continuing my look at the Tekken series with a focus on Devil Kazuya, Devil, and Angel, which are characters and concepts that have informed much of the Tekken story, and in particular the dramatic arc of anti-hero turned villain Kazuya Mishima. Now, to date on the channel, I've discussed central characters of the Tekken story, such as Kazuya, Heihachi, Jin, Ogre, and most recently Jun Kazama, and I'll link to these below. But impacting each of these characters, to some degree or another, the thing that has drawn them together, torn them apart, or otherwise influenced these core animosities and interrelationships has been the Devil, and to a lesser extent, for a brief but important episode, the Angel. And it's prudent to note that while both of these characters made their true debut and dictated the story of 1995's Tekken 2, something I've always loved since discovering it is that Devil Kazuya is a deeply hidden character and unlockable palette swap for Kazuya in Tekken 1, which can be accessed if you defeat the Galaga Space Raiders style game in the introduction. And I like this, and I think it's worth noting, firstly because back in the mid to late 90s, before the prevalence of being able to Google everything and find stuff online, is that it was very much a rumour that Devil Kazuya was available in Tekken 1, and it was something that circulated around, but wasn't something I actually saw with my own eyes until a friend managed to do it. And I know it's just a crude palette swap, but when you're like 10 years old, it's a really cool thing to see and sort of self-discover rather than just simply see it online. Secondly, much more importantly, the inclusion of Devil Kazuya in Tekken 1 shows that from the very outset, Kazuya was destined to be far from a clean-cut hero character, and there was a very consistent thread and story arc in mind for Tekken that anticipated his moral decay and the general plot structure that the Tekken saga might take, which was really nice to see, and it was great that they had all of this in mind from the outset of the series. So, jumping right in, let's shift into Tekken 2, where the focus was on Kazuya as an antagonist, and the Devil and Angel characters being the arbiters of his fate, duelling for Kazuya's soul. And as mentioned way back in my Kazuya episode, there's something very primal and elemental and familiar about this sort of character story, because it's been played out time and again in art and literature throughout history, from Shakespeare's Macbeth to Goethe's Faust, which is exploring this erosion of man's morality in pursuit of personal glory, success, or revenge. And these tales often come with a personified demon that the protagonist is dealing with. And I think the reason Kazuya and Tekken 2 remain so popular is that there's something very human in the flawed and tragic nature of him, having given in to a more darker side of himself. And this has persisted since Tekken 2, up to and including what we can assume will be Tekken 8, the next instalment. And the lingering question remains as to whether there's anything inherently redeemable in Kazuya or not, which in turn raises questions as to whether there's a further role for Jun Kazama, the Angel character, and all of this stuff I've recently discussed. So, much like the aforementioned literary examples, the Devil and Angel characters are presented in a very literal way in Tekken 2 as external entities that represent the conflicted elements of Kazuya's soul. And at this point in time, prior to the Devil Gene story, the fact that he has sold his soul to the devil in order to survive and defeat Heihachi when he's climbing back up that cliff as a child, and this accounts for the red eyes and stuff like that he has in the introduction animations, and in the end game when his devil form finally takes hold as the final boss. And it's important to note, because 1995 was such a long time ago, how climactic this was at the time. It was a very unexpected endgame for Tekken 2, and combined with the eerie final stage and the excellent soundtrack, Emotionless Passion, it really set a precedent not only for Kazuya and this devil narrative device, but the atmospheric final battles and experiences that Tekken games were now capable of having and building towards. And I think it set a precedent because, as I mentioned in my Ogre episode, Tekken 3 followed suit with a supernatural final boss, as did Tekken 5 with Jinpachi Mishima, Tekken 6 with Azazel. So it's clear that the positive reception of Devil in the final stage of Tekken 2 set off a chain reaction in subsequent games. But generally speaking, and as I've mentioned before, Devil and Ogre have been considered high points for the series, and the relevance of subsequent supernatural bosses have arguably been diminishing in return. And, for example, Azazel is much less popular with fans than Ogre is. And I think the reason this is that Devil and Ogre, in their own ways, have been relevant not just within their debut games and their numerical titles, but actually the subsequent core story arc of very important characters, such as Kazuya and also Jun Kazama, and they have shaped their entire personalities and subsequent goals and intentions in the later Tekken games. And I've said it before, but Kazuya being a protagonist that has this dramatic fall from grace by selling his soul, it's just not something that we tend to see in fighting games, or indeed any games or stories. So it was a very unique take, and one that is still playing out to this day. So I am very excited to see how Tekken 8 will perpetuate or conclude this. And the fact that there is a strong case for Jun Kazama to return in Tekken 8, as I've recently discussed, or at least the game to at least refocus itself on Kazuya's plight, because he's very much being teased as the central antagonist now, as a direct obstacle to Jin. I think it will be really interesting to see whether these moral conflicts re-emerge, and characters like not only Devil, but also Angel, who emerged out of Kazuya's confusion after he met Jun, and Devil, who was formerly this external entity, or at least capable of exiting its host in the original story, whether these things will enter the fray once more as the story progresses. And I think it's something a lot of us are anticipating as Tekken fans, and potentially will we see anything resolved around Kazuya. Now, on this note, I've mentioned it before, but the retcon of the external Devil entity being exchanged for the Devil Gene story is something of a conversation starter, I suppose, and while I get that this is now canon, and a lot of people like the Devil Gene story, I personally don't mind it, I want to stress that, but I do prefer the original arc, because I feel the genetic concept largely dilutes the significance of the external Devil and Angel, and the role that they play in the events of Tekken 2, and particularly hinging around Kazuya's extreme nature at having sold his soul, because now it's just a genetic misfortune that he's been born with, rather than something consciously done in an effort to survive and defeat his father, and this aforementioned fall from grace. And I'm not sure why it felt necessary for the Tekken team to do this, and the writers to do this. Some people argue that it was an opportunity to introduce more characters, such as Kazumi, and try and make her and Heihachi's backstory a bit more emotive and relevant. And some feel it was simply a more dramatic arc for Jun Kazama, because now he needs to break away from something that is literally in his blood, which is a fair point. But regardless, we've now seen the Devil assimilated into the respective characters that it inhabits, so Kazuya and Jin, which isn't entirely dissimilar from Tekken 2, or even Tekken the Motion Picture, where the external entity does exist and reside within Kazuya, and we see it kind of inflaming his scar at intervals where it's sort of emerging out of him. But in the video game specifically, from about Tekken 4 onwards, the team have doubled down on this, on the fact that it is an internal. And for Kazuya specifically, rather than residing in his scar, as the motion picture showed, it's now something that's kind of exhibited by his eye, which perpetually glows red to sort of hint at the devil within. And while Devil is only playable as an external being in Tekken 2 and Tekken Tag, it is integrated more fully into Kazuya as his rage art in Tekken 7, for example, while Devil Jin remains a selectable character, owing perhaps to his current significance as a protagonist within the story. So in all, the Devil and Angel components of Tekken are really fascinating concepts to emerge out of the game series and dictate the early Tekken story. And while other fighting games have sought to do similar things, with Evil Ryu, for example, in Street Fighter Alpha, none have committed to the downfall of their supposed hero and his dark moral decay in quite the same fashion. And the Kazuya Mishima arc, along with the relentless animosity between father and son, really set Tekken apart and continues to do so to this day. And I think it was a really potent way to kick off the Tekken series and provide a lot of dense lore and story for fans to get involved in. And personally, I hope it concludes as it began, with quite a dramatic moral conflict, and kind of Tekken 2 almost coming full cycle, because contrary to popular belief, I don't think Kazuya is quite past the point of no return just yet. And on that note, speaking about Tekken 2 being so far away, and even if they don't go down this path of having Kazuya redeemable, to this day I've no idea why they haven't opted to remake, or at least heavily remaster, the first 3 Tekken games, because they're immensely popular games, and I do go back to them, and they are starting to age, particularly when you come off the back of Tekken 7, so I'd really love to see remakes of those games. But anyway, if you got this far, thanks very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And please consider liking, subscribing, and of course commenting to let me know your thoughts on Angel and Devil, and also your personal favourite Tekken characters.